Mr. Secretary, in your statement, I think that the most troubling thing is the following quote from you. Even the most pessimistic assessment did not predict the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. I back that up by saying you also cite General Milley, who said there was no indication that there would be a rapid collapse of the Afghan army and government. For much of last year, I was the acting chairman of intelligence. I'm now the vice chairman of intelligence. I've been tracking this very, very closely. And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion. Putting that aside for a moment, we had every reason to believe and to plan for the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and the Afghan government. At the beginning of 2020, by all admissions, we had a already really bad status quo in Afghanistan. Okay, we had a small footprint, but we had a strong commitment to air support, and that sustained the Afghan security forces' ability to resist the Taliban. The security forces of Afghanistan were suffering 10,000 casualties a year. The Taliban was suffering casualties too, but they enjoyed safe haven in Pakistan. They were able to go there to rest, to refit, to train, to recruit. And so in summary, even before the withdrawal, we had a terrible status quo. The security forces, a small number of U.S. forces, continued to die. We had U.S. losses as well. I want to mention that. But the Afghan government was still fractious and corrupt. And the Taliban had an unchallenged safe haven in Pakistan. Or put another way, and paraphrasing your own words from your opening statement, if after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training, there's not enough for the Afghan government or the Afghan security forces to become more resilient or self-sustaining, what did we think was going to happen as that support began to be removed? What did we think was going to happen when that terrible status quo was changed? It doesn't take some exquisite piece of intelligence or some brilliant analysis to conclude that if you radically change an already bad status quo, by removing U.S. and NATO forces, by ending enablers and air support, the status quo was going to collapse in favor of the Taliban. This is not an argument in favor of staying. I think that ship has sailed, okay? And I know a lot of time has been spent on justifying the withdrawal. We're not debating the withdrawal. What I'm arguing is we had a terrible status quo as is. By your own admission, the Afghan government, even after billions of dollars in 20 years, was not self-sustaining, was not resilient. We should have known that as we began to draw down support, we were going to see the potential for a collapse. And that's what all these pieces pointed to as well. So it's concerning that no one saw all of this and concluded that there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there could be a rapid collapse. More to that point, we began to see clear signs weeks ago that this is where it was headed. Without airstrikes, the Taliban now began to mass and maneuver, going from intimidating these small Afghan outposts to actually getting them into quitting. We were seeing Afghan outposts begin to quit. The Taliban they went from surrounding these small provincial capitals to surrounding major cities with 5,000 to 8,000 Taliban fighters. This is weeks before. By the way, this is at the same time as I believe on July 8th, President Biden was still giving this naive, optimistic prediction about the fighting capabilities of the Afghan forces and so forth. We could see them meticulously focused on the north. You could see that they were methodically and carefully splintering the sclerotic remains of any sort of resistance. Weeks before the fall of Kabul, you could see the Taliban was on the verge, was headed towards doing something they hadn't done before. They were going to isolate Kabul from the north, cutting off all their supply routes. So we knew weeks before that we were headed for a Taliban control of the north. All the traditional routes of Taliban encroachment on Kabul were nearly sealed, the south and the east. Kabul faced the prospect of no fuel. The Afghan government faced the prospect of being unable to mount any viable opposition and sustain defense. What did we think was going to happen? All of those things were in place at the time. And I think the most concerning part of it is that if we didn't have an analysis that looked at all this, this wasn't a failure of intelligence. This was a failure of policy and planning. We have the wrong people analyzing this. Someone didn't see this. Either someone didn't see this or someone didn't want to see this because we had established this, we wanted to be out by September 11th so that we could have some ceremony arguing that we got and pulled out of Afghanistan on the anniversary of 9/11. The fact of the matter is, where it leaves us now, on top of all the other things that have been mentioned here from a geopolitical perspective, is not a good place. I think China and Russia and Iran, they look at this botched withdrawal, and what they see is incompetence that they think they might be able to exploit, may lead to miscalculation. I think the Europeans, our allies, who had very little say, if any, or control certainly over the timing and the execution of all this, they're now, number one, have to be wondering about our reliability, the credibility of our defense agreements with them, but they also have to be really, really upset at the prospects of a massive refugee crisis landing right on their borders here very soon. And India, and I know that there was an announcement today, there'll be a meeting of the Quad fairly soon, which is a good development, except that in the Pacific region, if you're India, you're looking at this and saying, if the United States allowed Pakistan to unravel their standing, because the Pakistani role in all this, and I think multiple administrations are guilty of ignoring it, the Pakistani role in enabling the Taliban is ultimately a victory for those pro-Taliban hardliners in the Pakistani government. They have to be looking at this and saying, if the United States could have a third-rate power like Pakistan unravel its aims, what chance do they have of confronting China? So I think this leaves us in a terrible situation, but I go back to the initial point. I don't know how it's possible. If in fact, the people in charge of our foreign policy did not see all of these factors and conclude that there was a very real possibility of a very rapid collapse, then we've got the wrong people making military and diplomacy decisions in our government.
Senator, I'm happy to respond briefly in the time that we have. As you know from your own expertise and leadership on these matters, there are constant assessments being done, and in this particular case, assessments being done of the resilience of Afghan security forces, of the Afghan government, and different scenarios established, from worst case to best case to everything in between. And ultimately, the preponderance of the intelligence and assessments land someplace, and there are always going to be voices, and critically important that we listen to all of them, who may be talking about exclusively the worst case, some best case, some in between. Here's what I can say in this setting, and we can take this up as well in other settings. Back in February, the assessment of the overall assessment of the community was that after a complete U.S. military withdrawal, that could potentially, in the worst case scenario, lead to the Taliban capturing Kabul within a year or two. So that's back in February, and that was more or less where things stood in the winter and into the spring. By July, and you're exactly right, that the situation was deteriorating as the Taliban continued to make progress on the ground throughout the summer. In July, the IC indicated that it was more likely than not that the Taliban would take over by the end of the year, the end of this year. That said, we, the intelligence community, did not say that the countrywide collapse of all meaningful resistance would be likely to occur in a matter of days. And you referenced Chairman Milley, as I did earlier. Nothing that he saw, that I saw, that we saw suggested that this government and security force would collapse in a matter of 11 days. And you're right that I think we need to look back at all of this because, to your point, we collectively, over 20 years, invested extraordinary amounts in those security forces and in that government. Hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, training, advice, support. And based on that, as well as based on what we were looking at real time, again, we did not see this collapse in a matter of 11 days. But I think it is important that we go back and look at all of this.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here.
Senator.
President Biden and the Biden administration have presided over the worst foreign policy catastrophe in a generation. Americans across the nation are horrified. Our servicemen and women, our active duty military are angry, they're disillusioned, and they're frustrated. Our enemies across the globe are emboldened, which makes the world more dangerous today for America, and our allies are dispirited. Ever since the disaster began unfolding in Afghanistan, we've seen the Biden administration making political excuses. We've seen Democrats on this committee explaining at great length how everything that happened in Afghanistan is Trump's fault. It's all Trump's fault. Mr. Secretary, Joe Biden is the President of the United States. Kamala Harris is the Vice President of the United States. You are the United States Secretary of State. Just like Jimmy Carter owns the disaster of the Iran hostage crisis, you own this. The Biden administration caused this disaster. It was caused by two things. Number one, ideological naivete and extremism. Repeatedly, Mr. Secretary, in this hearing and also on multiple conference calls over the last month, you keep saying things like the steps the Taliban needs to take to be welcomed into the community of civilized nations. Mr. Secretary, they don't want to be welcomed into the community of civilized nations. They are terrorists who want to murder us. This administration doesn't understand that. Joe Biden doesn't understand that. But sadly, that ideological extremism was combined with manifest incompetence. There were 4 decisions this administration made that I think were utterly indefensible. Number one, abandoning the Bagram airfield, giving it to the Taliban. That is a decision that 100 years from now will be studied at war colleges as a colossal strategic mistake, giving up 2 secure airfields, necessitating an evacuation from a dense urban environment, a commercial airport, which led tragically to the suicide bombings and murders that killed 13 American servicemen and women. Had we been evacuating from Bagram with a secure perimeter, the odds are quite high that attack either wouldn't have happened, or if it had happened, it would have been far less severe in its consequences. Secondly, the Biden administration giving the Taliban a list of Americans and of Afghans we wanted out. Third, the decision to leave Americans behind. Hundreds of Americans, perhaps more, perhaps thousands of green card holders, tens of thousands of Afghans who assisted the U.S. military. The Biden administration abandoned them and left them behind. And fourth, leaving billions of dollars of American military equipment that the Taliban will now use to threaten our lives. Earlier in this hearing, you said about that equipment, quote, none of it poses a strategic threat to us or their neighbors. That does not pass the laugh test. When you're looking at the Taliban potentially having 64,000 machine guns, 33 Black Hawk helicopters, 16,000 night vision goggles, we will see American blood spilled because of these colossal mistakes. Now, abandoning Bagram wasn't your call. It was the Pentagon's and the White House's ultimately. But I want to ask you flat out, did the State Department give the Taliban a list or multiple lists of Americans and or Afghans that we wanted out?
Those reports and the idea that we would do anything to endanger our citizens or anyone else at a time when we were trying to save their lives is flat out wrong. Let me.
So I just like a yes or no. Did you give them?
Let me be very clear, Senator, if I may, please. Thank you. In limited instances where we were seeking to get a bus or a group of people through a checkpoint, we gave a manifest to the people at the checkpoint to demonstrate that those people were expected.
Roughly how many names were on the list you gave?
Doesn't matter because they all...
Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Give us some order of magnitude.
This happened in a handful of situations where to
Dozens?
get through...
So is it your testimony it wasn't hundreds? I want to understand, did you give them thousands of names?
No,
yes
we did not.
Okay, hundreds?
Not going to put a number on it, but it was, again...
Why not? This is a hearing to discover how many names and how many of those individuals you gave the Taliban the name to have been targeted for torture or murder.
Senator, by definition, these were in limited instances with a bus or a group of people to get them through a checkpoint. They got through the checkpoint.
So not only did you fail to evacuate Americans and green card holders who were there. But you also brought in tens of thousands of Afghans who had wholly inadequate vetting, bringing many of them to the United States. And one of the things that has done is that has brought in a humanitarian crisis to America. Child marriage and domestic abuse, tragically, are widespread in Afghanistan. According to the World Health Organization, more than half of the women in Afghanistan are married as child brides, and 90% of women are subject to domestic abuse. 90%. On August 27th, according to public reports, you distributed internal documentation highlighting numerous instances in intake centers of sexual abuse in which much older grown Afghan males appeared with children, young children, claimed they were their brides, claimed they were their wives, and the document said the State Department urgently requested guidance. That was your word, urgently. Subsequently, the Department of Homeland Security said that it showed the desperation of families, that they were willing to give little girls to grown men to be subject to sexual abuse and child wives. My question is as follows. Did you receive that urgent guidance? How many children have been subject to sexual abuse? What have you done to rescue young children from illegal and abusive relationships after being brought to America by the State Department?
Across the entire government, everyone involved in the evacuation effort, whether it's at a transit point in one of the countries that we negotiated with, whether it's here in the United States at Dulles or Philadelphia or the military bases, we have all of our officers at extreme vigilance to look for and to deal with any cases or concerns that arise.
Did you receive the urgent guidance, and how many child brides have you seen?
I don't know the specific guidance you're referring to. I'm happy to look at it.
So is there not urgency to discover if children are being abused?
Absolutely.
Time of the senator has expired.
We could detect and deal with any cases, and there have been, to my knowledge, a limited number of cases where we have separated people because we were concerned that they were.
How many?
The cases I'm aware of, a handful.